Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about some early British history. And what we're going to do is start here in the beginning, where Great Britain is really just this big island and nobody's around. We're talking way back in ancient times, ancient Bible times, and nobody's here. To arrive around 8 to 600 BC were the Gaels and the Brythons, which, as you recognize, could be the modern day term Britons or Great Britain. Now, these people who showed up were very primitive people. They were indigenous to the wilderness. They probably worshipped nature. They were very basic tribal culture, and they basically spread throughout the land and lived in the trees and the mountains. And they lived in relative peace for a long time, until 55 BC when the Romans show up. Now, the Romans were trying to take Great Britain for a little while, but they were unsuccessful. And, to be honest, they probably didn't try a full-on Roman invasion. They were more just seeing if there were any soft spots on the coast of Britain. Now, these attempts were then finally succeeded by one of Rome's greatest rulers, Julius Caesar. In 55 AD, almost 100 years later, the Romans did a full-on invasion under the command of Julius Caesar. In fact, many of Julius Caesar's greatest campaigns were held there in Great Britain. The Romans take over, and now the Romans are in control of the land, and they were there for a long time, several hundreds of years under Roman rule. In 407 AD, about 400 years or so, the Romans left. And you try to think, why did the Romans leave? Well, there was trouble back home, and the Romans had to all leave from the outer perimeter of the empire and converge unto Rome itself. And so that left Great Britain into really just a remnant group of Roman soldiers trying to hold the land. And, we still have those Gaelic people, the Celtic people who spoke Gaelic. We still kind of have them hanging around too. And these conditions were perfect for a new force to come in and occupy. As the Anglo Saxons in 407 AD. The Anglo Saxons basically took the entire region, kicked out anything that was left of Rome, and marginalized the indigenous Celtic people. So under the Anglo Saxons, a new culture had taken over Great Britain. In 597 AD, the Anglo-Saxons had converted to Christianity, mostly because their leader had converted. And back then, if the leader's going to be Christian, guess what? Everybody needs to be Christian. About 800 AD, trouble comes from the north. The Danes had left their ice-cold homeland in Denmark, and they traveled across the fog-drenched sea and finally hit the coast of Great Britain. And they land there in their longboats in about 800 AD. And one of the first things they saw was a monastery. And in that monastery were monks, of course, and there was a lot of treasures, golden chalices that were used for communion, other religious relics that were of great value. And the Danes, what they saw were not a group of holy men, as we might see, but they saw a bunch of unarmed men with treasure. So the Danes took advantage of the situation and slaughtered every monk there. And they continued to terrorize and pillage the villages and churches, and traveled all the way down south until they hit the heart of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom in the south. 886 AD, the Danes had hit a wall, almost practically literally, between them and the Anglo Saxons, and so a demilitarized zone was formed where the Danes are in the north, Anglo Saxons in the south, and a lot of buildup of military power between the two. It's much like the situation in North Korea and South Korea today. Now, over time, however, the Danes won enough and finally conquered the land. So in 1066 AD, the Danes took complete control of Great Britain, and now this was pretty much all Viking country. Maybe a few ancient Romans, maybe some Celtic people, maybe some Anglo Saxons scattered throughout, but the Danes had now taken over. What's the worst enemy to a Viking? Well, another Viking, and that was William of Normandy, and they were called the Normans, and they were in France, which is just south of this map here, practically right across the street, so to speak. And so William, or Bill, he comes in and he claims his right to the throne of Great Britain. They deny it, and so he comes in with his troops and takes Great Britain by storm. In 1071 he takes over Great Britain, and now we have the French language, and the French Vikings are now in control of Great Britain. So once again, Great Britain changes hands. In 1154 AD we have our first king of England, King Henry, and you have to understand, for there to be a king and for there to be castles and fortresses and things we see in storybooks, you need to have a relatively large amount of time of peace. And so there was enough peace that they were able to build up enough armies and enough castles and fortresses to hold themselves off from any future invaders. So now a bunch of guys jumping off a boat with axes can't exactly take over like they had done a few hundred years back. So the first family, the Plantagenets, are now in charge of Great Britain. By 1189 we have King Richard I. He was a young king. He invested most of the money in Great Britain's naval power. 1199 King John has to pay the bill for that naval power. And so he comes with this idea of the Magna Carta, which is a sort of a taxation system you'll read more about in your book. By 1348, a significant event is the Black Death, wipes out a very large number of the population, and we are now in the heart of the medieval ages. Then you have a succession of kings. We are here full on in the medieval times. Henry the Fifth and the Sixth. And these three kings make up a whole bunch of wild stories by Shakespeare. Shakespeare loved to write about the exploits of these three Henrys and makes light of their royalty and their situation. Of course, Shakespeare was born much later after these events. And then you have the Yorks versus the Lancaster in the War of the Roses. And the Tudors come in, so you have three people. Finally, the Yorks and the Lancasters get married, and this sort of is the sunset of the medieval ages as we then move forward and progress into the Renaissance.